Hey folks, Rob Breakenridge here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube page. Be sure to like and subscribe. Also, you can find full episodes of our podcast, The Rob Breakenridge Show, at robbreakenridge.ca, as well as on Spotify and other platforms. This next conversation is with a prominent voice and highly regarded political thinker in Canada, who has a dire warning about the state of democracy in our country. We are, of course, just coming off a transition from a prime minister's resignation, a new prime minister's ascension, and an election which produced yet another minority government for the Liberal Party. For as much as there is cynicism and frustration around elections, governance, and democratic institutions, there still may be a belief that our system is strong. But our next guest lays out in great detail in his new book the deep challenges and dysfunctions we face in our political system. It is a wake-up call, but also a call to action. Andrew Coyne is a columnist for the Globe and Mail, and he is the author of the new book, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. Here's that conversation. Our next guest is a columnist for the Globe and Mail, and he is the author of an important and timely new book entitled The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, available now. Andrew Coyne, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Always a pleasure, Rob.
It's been an eventful few months, obviously. The timing of the book is interesting. I'd imagine much of it was completed before the election and all of that. But is there anything you've seen over the last several months here that have either confirmed parts of your thesis or maybe changed or challenged some of it?
Well, I guess the most significant thing is here we are in the middle of this enormous crisis where we're dealing with suddenly a hostile power to our south that we've always assumed was our best friend and protector. And Parliament's been dark for 5-6 months and nobody cares.
Yeah.
I think if you had any confirmation of the decline of Parliament, how little it is a part of people's mindset, how little significance they attach to it, I think the last few months would confirm that. And of course, all the shenanigans that went on before that, how we got into the situation where the Liberal Party was absolutely united in its opposition to its own leader, but couldn't get rid of him because the power of the leader is so entrenched in our system. How he was able to leave the job, but not leave the job, prorogue Parliament for several months while they went about the business of choosing a new leader. All these things which are just completely flagrantly opposed to the principle of responsible government, where the government is supposed to be accountable to the Parliament every day of the year. It just is remarkable that we put up with it. But I guess one of the theses of the book is these things feed on themselves. We're so used to Parliament not mattering. We're so used to members of Parliament not mattering that we're not even aware of it anymore. It's hard to get people roused about it because they've forgotten why they should care.
Has that created cynicism? Is this a byproduct of cynicism? Is that part of the problem here?
Yeah, cynicism and complacency. We're a very successful country by any measure. And our democracy in some ways looks pretty good. We hold free and fair elections. Nobody's beaten up at the polling booth, and corruption and fraud are minimal. By these kinds of very formal procedural standards, we do pretty well. And I think it's kind of blinded us to the ways in which, in a more substantive way, but in a real and practical way, our democracy is falling short. So, yeah, we hold elections, and that's great. But the MPs that we elect to Parliament have really ceased to be any kind of serious representative for our ridings in terms of their ability to actually exercise whether your theory is they should represent what the riding constituents believe or whether you think they should be exercising their own independent judgment. They're not doing either. They're essentially representatives and foot soldiers for the party. And the Parliament as a whole is no longer able to really exercise effective oversight and accountability checks on the government of the day. We've seen this time after time after time with scandal after scandal on either Liberal or Conservative governments, where basically Parliament can't put a glove on them. And certainly in terms of the usual functions of debating and scrutinizing and subjecting legislation to the kinds of searching scrutiny that it's supposed to have, that's more or less ceased to function as well. So it's you could be forgiven for being cynical or just sort of shrugging at it and just forgetting why it mattered.
Well, in that sense, too, is it obvious that we're in a crisis? And that's the case you're laying out. But I think people assume that if we were in a crisis, it would be far more obvious.
Well, it's a slow motion crisis, perhaps. At one level, it's a crisis of legitimacy that people don't see the parliament as their parliament. They don't see the government as their government. I think it's reflected in these appalling turnouts. We got a bit of a blip up in this recent election because of the crisis atmosphere around it. But generally speaking, the secular trend is down, down, down. Not only at the federal level, but provincial elections, you're now seeing turnout in the 40% range. Municipal elections even lower. In some by-elections, we've had turnout of 15%. So people are getting out of the habit of voting. Well, that has knock-on effects. We're dealing right now, for example, with provinces, not just Alberta, but other provinces, essentially passing flagrantly unconstitutional legislation. It used to be provinces demanded powers from the federal government. Now they just take them. They pass legislation that asserting powers that they don't have. Or certainly, when we see the continuing scandal 158 years after Confederation, that we still don't have a common market. Well, these are things that the federal government, that's why you have a federal government to deal with. But the feds don't feel they can because they don't have legitimacy. Because, as I say, people don't see that parliament as their parliament. They see it as Ottawa, that far off place they send MPs to and they're never heard from again. So the ability of the federal government to manage the federation is very much, I think, in a crisis mode, even at present. But now think about we're going forward. We're going to have to make a lot of very tough decisions. People understand this, that we've got to make real changes on our defense policy, on trade policy, on the economy. A lot of it driven by the crisis with the Americans. We have a system. We have an electoral system in this country that creates and exaggerates the real divisions within our country. So, for example, in Alberta this time, the Liberals got 30% of the vote, or near to 30% of the popular vote. That's the best they've done since 1968. But they only got 2 seats, as usual. And so it's easy to say, well, the Liberals have, they don't speak for Albertans at all, and why should we even listen to them? And they're just some alien foreign government. And of course, there's some truth in that. The Liberals over the years, there's a reason why they have not paid a lot of attention to Alberta's interests and concerns, because they would say, because we can't win any seats there.
Right.
Or you flip around and you say, because they don't need to win any seats there, because they've racked up a majority in Alberta and Ontario and Quebec. That, again, is a function of the exaggerations and distortions of the first-past-the-post system, which rewards parties for agglomerating their vote in geographic terms. So we have a system, in other words, that creates a kind of a funhouse mirror distortion of the country. To look at the way in which the seats are counted, you'd think there were no Liberals in Western Canada. You'd think there were no Conservatives in Quebec. You'd think there were no Conservatives in the big cities. You'd think there were no Liberals in the rural parts of the country. And this is all of which is not true. But it encourages the very divisions that we're worried about. Well, to come back to my point about the concerns I have in the current situation, we've gotten by in the last few decades because of the divisions that our system is making worse by basically not confronting these issues. Because we know that if we ever did make these big changes and big policy decisions, we might have a rupture. Because what? Because why? What does that entail? It means a government with less than 40% of the vote, most of it in one part of the country, is supposed to ram through policy changes that might be repugnant to the other part of the country. And we know how damaging and divisive that can be. I'm very worried, even if the policies are good policies, I'm very worried in the next few years that we're going to be confronting these kinds of divisions. So yeah, it is a crisis.
And it's interesting. And you make the point there, because when we talk about democracy, and people might sort of equate democracy to the practice of going to the polls, or the way in which we elect a government, that's an exercise in democracy. But we're talking about in terms of Canadian democracy. It's all of it. It's the lead up to elections. It's the process of elections. It's the way in which governments are formed. Then, of course, it's the exercise of governing, the role of Parliament. It's all of that.
That's right. So this book tries to tie together a number of different strands, a number of different problems, all of which there's abundant research on. People have written, could write more books about each one of them. But it's when you tie them all together and you look at it and you go, okay, none of the institutions and arrangements that we count on for our democracy is working in the way that it should. So the government is not really accountable to the House of Commons. The House of Commons is really kind of basically run by the government. The party leaders are not answerable to their caucuses. The caucuses are basically answerable to the leaders. The prime minister is not a part of a cabinet. The cabinet is basically an extension of the prime minister. So we've lost some of these really important accountability connections. And one of the points I try to make in the book is democracy is not just what happens on election day, it's what happens every day in between. So we have a lot of problems with our elections, as I've tried to suggest, in terms of our electoral system and how accurately it reflects what we really want in when we vote. But it's even worse when you just think of the everyday work of democracy in between those elections, where we're simply not holding people to account. One example of that is the way in which we elect the party leaders. Used to be party leaders were elected by the caucus. That's the classic Westminster model. It's still in place in most other Westminster democracies in one form or another. We thought it would be a good idea back in 1919, when the Liberals were the first to do it, to elect the leader by the party membership at large. And isn't that more democratic, getting more people involved? Of course, as it's evolved, it's not just the party membership, it's the party membership plus hundreds of thousands of instant members signed up in the course of the leadership race, which raises all kinds of problems on its own. But when you actually look at the practical effects of that, what it really means is the leader is elected by that, electoral college, if you will, of hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom just signed up for the race, most of whom are never seen again. They vote on that one day and they have nothing to do with the party afterwards. Many of them might have no interest in the party, might even be hostile to it. And after that, the leader's accountable to nobody. He can thumb his nose at the caucus for years at a time if he likes, because there's not much the caucus can do about it. Eventually, if it really gets horrific, if the leader is just, as we saw with Justin Trudeau, has to go, then you can spend 2 years trying to remove him. But good luck to you, because the leader has so much power that nobody wants to be the first to move. We saw this, right? Everybody was skulking around in the shadows because they didn't want to be the first to suffer the leader's wrath. So that is the problem. It looks more democratic to choose the leader that way. It turns out on a day-to-day basis to be much less democratic. You're basically imposing on the caucus a leader that they had no choice, no say in choosing. And then expecting them to follow where he leads. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, on that point, there are some provisions that now exist. The Conservative caucus, they decided that Aaron O'Toole should no longer be the leader. So maybe some steps in that direction.
Well, that's right. So that was a result of the Reform Act, which was a private member's bill brought forward by Michael Chong, a reform-minded MP of the Conservative Party. He was only able to pass it in kind of watered down form. But one of the things he was trying to address was this power of the caucus versus the leader. And he was able to get through a bill that said, if the caucus votes after an election to assume this power, along with some other powers, then they will have the power to remove the leader. And the first party to do that was the Conservatives. And when it came time to remove Aaron O'Toole, who had gotten offside with the caucus on various matters, it was all done in 2 days. Yeah. And that was a watershed event. That puts every future Conservative leader on notice that if they cannot simply ignore the concerns and interests of the caucus. And you saw not a few Liberals in the dying days of the Trudeau government wishing they'd availed themselves of that power. We'll see whether they do in future. But that's definitely that's a hopeful sign.
So as you say, that's one element that has a longer history, but much of what you talk about and what you identify as the crisis is a more recent phenomenon. One example is just how we take for granted the governments are just going to ram through legislation, even large sweeping bills, omnibus bills, as we often refer to them, invoking closure, for example, something that once upon a time was kind of unheard of or almost scandalous for a government to do.
Yeah, one of the ways I try to explain this to people is, let's think of the various things that we think we elect MPs to do, the things we elect them to do, to debate legislation, to scrutinize legislation, to propose legislation and ultimately to pass legislation, to vote on it. Well, okay, they can debate legislation, as you say. It'll be pretty rote. Nobody's minds are changed. These days, a lot of times the speeches are written for them. But in the crunch, if the debate is ever likely to go anywhere, the government has the power to invoke a time allocation, which is the sort of softer version of closure, but pretty much amounts to the same thing. And in recent years, certainly under majority governments, that would describe half the bills passed, is they were passed with the use of time allocation. As you mentioned, that used to be incredibly rare. One of the biggest fights in Canadian history, the pipeline debate in 1956, was fought because the government invoked closure in peacetime, and people were scandalized. This had not happened in 20 years. Now it happens every other day and nobody bats an eye. So there's an example where MPs are simply not performing the role assigned to them. Scrutinizing legislation, again, if you're putting forward these omnibus bills where you're yoking together dozens of different bills of completely different subject matter and forcing MPs to vote all of them together up or down, how can you know, first of all, what MPs intended on any piece of that monster package? But secondly, how can you give proper scrutiny to a bill that's 800 pages long? It's ridiculous. Right. And yet that's become, certainly with omnibus budget bills, that's become the norm under both parties. Proposing legislation, most MPs will never see a bill that they sponsored pass into law. About 3 of them do a year. Private members' bills have just ceased to be any kind of serious part of the legislative agenda. And finally, voting on legislation. Study by the Samara Center found that MPs vote with their party 99.6% of the time. The biggest maverick voted against his party, I think it was 3% of the time. This not only is this worse than it was in the past, but it's way different than in other countries. All countries have a high degree of party discipline, but we've taken it just to extraordinary lengths. In the British Parliament, 1 in 5 MPs votes against their party or breaks with their party at least 2% of the time. In our parliament, only 1. So you can see how we've taken party discipline just to an absurd extent.
Well, it's interesting. And part of it is the convenience for government of just, not having to bother with these things, the concentration of power in leaders' offices. But to that point, I wonder how much of this reflects kind of a hyperpartisanship that exists in this era where you have to be loyal to your party. You have to crush the opposition, that it's, the stakes are raised and there's no room for disloyalty, or else you're one of them to some extent. Is that an element here?
Sure, but that is largely a function of leadership control. When MPs, when your view is simply whatever the view of the leader is, then you're no longer conducting politics on the basis of ideological differences. Tribalism is basically what takes over. Yeah, because your fight with the other guys isn't necessarily that you disagree with them. You might agree with them, or you might have a principled disagreement with them, but when it's just simply say and do whatever the leader tells you to do, then that replaces substantive differences and it just becomes pure tribalism. So some of the nastiness of our politics is a function of the emptiness of it. And the emptiness of it is a function of it being entirely driven and controlled by the leaders. I should say, we talked about the leader is no longer chosen by the caucus, but even worse is the caucus is basically chosen by the leader. They're chosen in literal terms when they seek the nomination, in that more than half of them are simply appointed. We think we have a system in which nominations are won in competitive local riding association races. Well, that describes only about 1 in 5, less than 1 in 5 races now, or ridings now. In most of them, they're either appointed by the leader or they run unopposed, meaning everybody knows they're the choice of the party establishment. And even where there is a contested race, there's all kinds of shenanigans that have become, I think, more and more a matter of concern, because it used to be, okay, they stacked the meeting, they brought in busloads of instant members, shenanigans. Now we know that's a really important vehicle for foreign interference. Right. And so it's become less funny. It was always bad, but it's become really serious now when we can see what that was happening. But the fact that the leader basically has a veto on the nominations of every MP, including sitting MPs, that they have to get the leader's approval to stand for Parliament. It just gives it's one of the many powers the leader has over them, and that's why our politics have become so completely leader-centered.
And the fix then, if there is one, I mean, we mentioned the Reform Act, which was maybe some baby steps in this direction, but otherwise, I mean, we saw Justin Trudeau's very cynical promise on electoral reform, and that kind of imploded, and maybe that's dead. And the idea that party leaders or prime ministers are going to give up this power seems like a big ask. So are we stuck in this?
Well, it's a real question. So as you say, the conundrum, the catch-22 in any reform proposal is that people who would have to enact those reforms are the people who benefit from the system as it is now, the people who got there as a result of that system. So you can talk about, there's a lot of good reforms that have been proposed. For example, to move some of the powers that are now the prerogatives of the prime minister to decide when debate should end, for example, to give that to the speaker. Or to take powers that are, again, the preserve of the prime minister to decide when to dissolve parliament, for example, and make the subject of a vote of supermajority of parliament. So there's various proposals, pardon me, to distribute some of these powers, but ultimately the prime minister would have to agree to that. Does that make the system hopeless? I don't think so, but it means that probably reform will only happen in one of two ways. One is the kind of incremental thing, starting with things like the Reform Act, where, right now we're caught in a lot of vicious circles where Parliament is weak because nobody cares about it because Parliament is weak. Why should we give more powers to MPs? Because they're such peons and nobodies. But if MPs start to acquire powers, if you can get the ball rolling, and one of the signal powers to give them is the power to remove the leader, then that perhaps can start to take on its own momentum. That the newly empowered MPs will start feeling a little friskier and will start thinking about other powers that they think they ought to have. And that would be a very useful development. So there's some glimmer of hope perhaps there. I wouldn't want to overstate it. But the other way is you just get into such a crisis, again, possibly because of national unity concerns, that eventually people say, okay, I think we've gotten into such a state. We've got nothing to lose now about thinking about more systemic reforms. And so, and that's, as I say in the book, that's how we got Confederation. They were so deadlocked, and the system was clearly not working. And eventually sworn enemies decided to line up together because there was no alternative. They had to embrace more systemic reform. And we may get to that situation.
It's interesting too. I mean, we've had now successive minority governments, and maybe there was some hope that even with the instability that brings, that it might change some of this. It might give MPs more leverage or make governments more conciliatory. But I don't know if we've actually really seen that.
It's hard to say. It's certainly, we're certainly becoming used to it. This is the sixth election in the last 8 that's produced a minority parliament. So if the argument for first past the post is, it produces the firm smack of authority, say what you will about it, at least we get majority governments, that's not actually the case anymore. We'll see whether, this election, there seemed to have been a trend towards a two-party system, and we'll see whether that continues, but I doubt it. I think the tendency towards multi-parties is pretty entrenched in Canadian politics, and when you've got multi-parties, first past the post really doesn't work. So, minority parliaments, there's at least a little more hope for holding governments to account. When you have a majority government, this election, my main thing was I didn't want any party to have a majority, because when you have a majority government with majority control of the committees, it means it's impossible to have any accountability. Majorities plus rigid party line voting, the party leaders control the committees, complete control of the committees. So that instrument of accountability is just basically washed out. That's never to anybody's benefit. But it hasn't yet produced, as you say, a surge in MPs asserting themselves. But we'll see. Maybe if we keep doing it, maybe people will realize.
Indeed. Well, the book is out now. It is called The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, and much more from you, of course, at theglobeandmail.com. Andrew Coyne, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for the conversation here today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob. I enjoyed it very much.